Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Dr. Ron Westrum to the Complexity Lounge. Ron is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Eastern Michigan University, where he's taught for over 50 years. He is the author of an influential paper titled A Typology of Organizational Cultures, which is often referred to as the Westrum Organizational Typology, as well as an important book on the development of the Sidewinder Missile system in the 1950s. In today's talk, Ron will be discussing hidden events, that is, things or events that are seemingly contrary to ordinary experience, but which may be effectively covered up or hidden by ignorance or deception. So with that, Ron Westrum, welcome to the lounge.
Thank you, Jocko. So there used to be a television show called What's My Line? And so what I'm going to do today is a different television show called What's My Sideline? Many of you will know that I'm an organizational theorist, and I spent a lot of time on that, obviously. But the other thing is that I've had this sideline for many years, and I've spent a lot of time looking into this. And this is about hidden events. So what is a hidden event? I think Jocko gave you a pretty good definition, but the best definition that I found was not even my own, it was somebody else's, in a book on near-death experiences. And it said that a near-death experience is a kind of event that is widely experienced, but very well hidden. That's pretty good for a definition of hidden events, where there's a wide number of experiences, but it's very well hidden. So let me look at a couple of these that I think are interesting stories to start out with. So one story was the story of finding a harp by Elizabeth Mayer, who was a psychoanalyst at Berkeley. Her daughter had had a very expensive harp that had gotten stolen, and she went to the police. She went to various kinds of, musical dealers and so forth, and was not getting any traction. She was not being able to find her instrument. So somebody said, well, if you're really serious about finding the harp, why don't you hire a dowser? So she literally called up the Dowsing Association. The president of the Dowsing Association talked to her. He was in Arkansas. She was in Berkeley. And she said, well, I have this harp that's been stolen, and I'd like to know where it is. And he said, I can tell it's still in Oakland, where it had gotten stolen. And he said, if you send me a map of Oakland, I'll tell you where the harp is. So she sent him a map, obviously post haste. And eventually he called back and he said, here's the house. It's such and such a address, basically. And so then she put posters up in the neighborhood of this house. It's saying, if you return the harp, basically, there'll be a small reward and there'll be no legal action taken against you. She got the harp back. So for her, this really didn't make sense. How is it that dowsing worked in the way it did, that somebody in another city could figure out where the harp was when she couldn't? Okay. So she began to think about this as an academic, and then essentially asked a lot of her colleagues, well, has anything like this happened to you? Are there paranormal experiences in your life? And what she found was that there were lots of people who had paranormal experiences. They weren't all of the same kind, but all these paranormal experiences had become essentially hidden events in the sense that they didn't communicate them to other people. So she then essentially went on a mission to find out what more was known about stuff like this. And in her book, Extraordinary Knowing, which I recommend to you, she goes into her experiences with the Stanford Research Institute and the CIA and so on and so forth, all about essentially hidden events. And she talks about the early psychologists like William James and Freud and so forth, and their attitude about things like this. So that's story number one. Story number two is funny. It's funny because there was a place in upstate New York where people started to see small kangaroos jumping around. Now, as far as I know, small kangaroos, we call them wallabies, I suppose, are not native to New York. So what happened is basically all these people were seeing these wallabies, but they wouldn't tell anybody else. Because how do you say, I just saw a small kangaroo? You know, people will think you're nuts. Finally, some police officer had seen these things twice in a row, and then he blabbed and said, there must be something going on. And all of a sudden, then people spoke up and they said, well, we've been seeing this all along, but we didn't want to tell anybody else. Okay. So there was a kind of what social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance among people, that lots of people were seeing these things, but they didn't feel they could communicate it to other people. So this gives you some idea of sort of everyday hidden events, from basically using dowsing to seeing strange things moving around. And I got interested basically about this stuff, but because of my interest in cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is the study of unknown animals or animals that aren't supposed to be there, but seem to be seen by people anyway. And I started out with sea serpents, and all my colleagues who were familiar with my work in the sociology of science said, well, why are you wasting your time on this kind of stuff? But nonetheless, I did a lot of work on this. Eventually, I wrote to the person, Bernard Heuvelmans, who had written this big tome on sea serpents, and I sent him a list of errors in his book. We became fast friends, and I knew him basically from that point until he died. So that's how I started out. I looked at hidden events associated with strange animals and things like that. But sooner or later, I got onto UFOs, and I thought there must be some sort of similar sociology of hidden events with UFOs. So I tried this out on several of my academic colleagues and got answers, if anything, even more negative than the hidden animals had gotten. But somehow I never lost interest in it. And I'm going to talk a little bit later and talk about what I think what implications this has, I think, for where we are today. So somewhere along the line, I began to look at other kinds of hidden events. And I started out with the discovery of meteorites in the 18th century. So since a lot of the action took place in France, and I read French, I did a study essentially of the history of meteoritics. And I remember one day when I was in Paris giving a copy of this to a meteoriticist. Meteoritists are people who study meteorites. And his reaction was, well, thank you. And I thought, well, there goes nothing. Why did I do this? And about 4 years later or so, I got an invitation from him to address the Meteoritical Society about the history of meteoritics. And I gave a plenary lecture essentially on this topic. I thought that was just splendid. But before I talked, he said, you're not allowed to discuss sea serpents or UFOs. I said, okay. But then I thought, well, gee, if science doesn't learn from its experience, what good is it? So anyway, meteoritics is a fascinating thing. And of course, I was fascinated by the attitudes that were shown by people back in the 18th century about this stuff. And some of these attitudes were things which are still important today. So let me just mention one of them. So in about 1757, the head of the British Royal Society had considered this idea that stones could fall from the sky. And he said, the thing is, if these stones had really fallen, we would have so strong proof of it today that there would be no doubt of the matter. Now, this is a very interesting sort of scientifically arrogant attitude. And the arrogance, of course, is to think, well, gee, if this stuff had really taken place, I would be the one to know about it. Well, we find this again and again looking at hidden events. So the next scene takes place in Edinburgh, where I'm taking a course in forensic medicine for lawyers, taught by John Mason, the professor of forensic medicine. And Mason is talking about something called the battered child syndrome. So I listened to this for a while and I think, my God, this is another one of my hidden events. So I didn't do anything at the moment. What I did when I got back to the United States, because I was having a fellowship at the University of Edinburgh, is I began to contact many of the people who had been involved in the early years of the battered child syndrome. And I have still a lot of the tapes that I recorded from these people about what it was that they thought, why they thought it, and what they did about it. And certainly the most interesting of these was an interview with Henry Kemp. Those of you who know anything about child abuse will realize that Henry Kemp was the person who essentially blew this out of the water by having a meeting. This was 1961, and he was head of the pediatric academy. And apparently this is something that is not a place, but an event. And so he was given the possibility of having a topic on anything he wanted to have in one of the sessions. And he decided that the topic that he would pick would be child abuse. And somebody else said, well, it doesn't sound like a very sexy title. Why don't you call it the battered child syndrome? He said, okay, we'll do that. So the reason that Kemp was interested in this is that he had found from his own physicians at the University of Colorado, where he was head of the Department of Pediatrics, that many of his residents misdiagnosed what was clearly child abuse. And so here was something which was going on. Physicians were responding to this as if it was some sort of disease, but not recognizing this for its real nature, which was that somebody was abusing children. So Kemp decided then that he would use his panel at the Pediatric Academy to talk about what he called the battered child syndrome. And he decided that this particular meeting would take place in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House in Chicago, which I guess seated at the time about 1,000 people. And he put together an interdisciplinary panel of people, social worker, somebody from the law, physicians, radiologists, and so forth. And he just took this subject, which was something which was a truly hidden event, and blew it wide open. And you can see, if you look at the index of periodicals and so forth, how this subject expands over the years that followed 1961. Just to make sure, Kemp also put an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled The Battered Child Syndrome, and essentially the world changed as a result of his being willing to do this. Now, there are several questions, of course, that you immediately want to ask yourself. And one of them is, well, gee, didn't they know about child abuse before? And the answer is yes, they did. It's in Charles Dickens and many other pieces of literature. And, people were aware that children were abused. But what had happened is that in the meantime, we'd got radiology. And in about 1952, the radiologists began to see things in children's bones, which suggested that they had been abused. And one of these was that there would be bones that were broken in different places, in different stages of healing. And so a radiologist then published an article and said, well, there's obviously something going on here. We're looking at a syndrome that includes injuries to the head and injuries to the long bones and so forth. There's something happening. So that was what essentially had led in the end to Henry Kemp doing what he did to publicize what he called the battered child syndrome. So one of the questions was, so how many cases of this were there? And was there some other explanation for the breaking bones besides abuse? So Kemp and his colleagues essentially hired a sociologist and asked him to do a study of, how many cases there were. So he then wrote letters to hospitals and police departments and so forth, and he finally came up with the number 700. Okay, well, those of you who know anything about child abuse will realize that this is several orders of magnitude less than the actual number. But it's interesting that basically this had somehow managed to remain in the shadows. And this is typical of hidden events. Hidden events remain in the shadows, even though lots of people experience them. They remain in the shadows because of the pluralistic ignorance that I had mentioned before. But they also remain in the shadows because in many cases, the people who are hiding these events are people who are complicit in some way in the whole process. Okay, so as I began to look at these things, and I looked at quite a number of other events, some of them I didn't go into great detail with, ball lightning. So ball lightning originally was considered to be a relatively rare event. And one of the reasons it was a rare event is that people who handed out questionnaires in the lightning business often didn't ask about it. Just the fact of not asking about it often meant that people, didn't feel that they could divulge the experiences they had, and they didn't want to be thought of as kooks by people who considered anybody who believed in lightning bolts crazy. So the interesting thing about the ball lightning thing then is that here is something that apparently was either a really rare event or is just impossible. It couldn't be. Well, the truth is that they finally decided, and I'm not sure who they were, I remember this from the past, somebody decided to do a survey in a couple big national laboratories and asked people, have you ever seen a lightning ball? So about 1 in 20 said yes, they had seen a lightning ball. So this was clearly not that rare an event. 1 in 20 is pretty good number. And so, here's an example of another hidden event. So there are similar things with spontaneous human combustion. Now, many of you who've read Charles Dickens realize that in one of his books, I think it's Bleak House, he describes a perfectly ordinary case of spontaneous human combustion, which sounds like almost a contradiction in terms. How can people's bodies catch fire unless you pour gasoline on them and light it? Okay. Well, the truth is, a lot of police departments come across cases of spontaneous human combustion. In fact, I had an officer who was in charge of crime evidence write me a letter from England. And he said, well, I came across one of these cases. He said, but I can't get any traction on this. Nobody wants to talk about this. And so there was actually some sort of debate about whether this could actually happen or not. But suffice it to say, if you begin to look into the literature, you'll find lots and lots of cases. And by the way, this was also, looking into the literature, also proved to be a potent thing in the meteorite controversy, because this was how the person who essentially is often seen as the discoverer of meteorites, Ernst Chladni, came across the fact of meteorites being real. He was having a discussion one night with another academician at the University of Göttingen. And so the other person said, well, maybe, meteorites come from lightning. And so Chladni said, well, no, he said the lightning trace is kind of jagged and so forth. These things tend to move in a straight line. So then Chladni goes down to the local library in Göttingen, and he spends a couple of weeks looking at things. And he says at the end of this time, he said, it became obvious that every so often stone or metal things fell from the sky. So he wrote a little book about it, and his book was soundly attacked by various colleagues and so forth as being crazy. And because he was a famous acoustics person, nonetheless, it didn't affect his scientific reputation otherwise. And eventually, in other countries, scientists began to collect things that were purported to have fallen from the sky and found out that actually many of them had a lot in common. And even as late as, I think, the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson was presented with a couple pieces of stuff that had fallen from the sky. And so Jefferson takes a look at it, and he takes a look at the person who's presenting, and he says, well, he said, I can tell you in 5 words what the explanation of this is. It is all a lie. Well, fortunately for everybody else, essentially in time, even Jefferson was convinced that there were things that fell from the air. So hidden events. Now, hidden events have something in common with serial crimes. And that is that often it takes people seeing several of them in a short period of time to realize that there's something going on. If you look at cases of killer nurses and so forth, or people who poison people, or old people in hospitals, or even physicians who are known to have killed a lot of their patients, it's amazing how many cases can pile up before somebody says, well, hey, there's something going on here. So the thing about hidden events is that eventually somebody says, okay, there's enough of them that I can see that there's actually a pattern here. And then people begin to say, well, maybe we need to think about there having some sort of scientific explanation for this. Well, I had mentioned along the line previously that I was interested in UFOs. And I thought, well, maybe UFOs are a hidden event. And you say, well, how can that be? Don't people write about UFOs and talk about that stuff? And the answer is, well, yes, they do. And in fact, there's even cases like Roswell, where ostensibly the government has stepped in and collected a whole bunch of debris. So is it really a hidden event? Well, try to get some any of the evidence from Roswell today from the government, and you'll rapidly begin to appreciate what a hidden event is. So if it's true that the government then collects fallen UFOs, wouldn't that be interesting to know? And what kind of implications would it have for the rest of us if it's true? And it would appear that on November 13th, there's going to be another government hearing, and maybe we'll learn some more about this from the intelligence people who are sort of doing the dance of the seven veils as they gradually peel away the coverings and so on, are mentioning little parts of this and so forth. But at the same time, assuring us really there's no evidence this is from outer space. There's no reason to worry about it. And so essentially, here's a perfect example of something that could be a hidden event. Now, this also implies, as Jocko said originally, that there can be people who are duplicitous, who are essentially lying about the fact that they know that something's going on. Well, so many of us feel, especially people who've been doing work on this for a while, that this is probably something where the government is really not telling us the truth. And it would be very interesting to know. Jocko, you had mentioned that we should pause for a moment and ask if people have any questions. Why don't we do that?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Barbara.
So does anyone have anything that they would like to ask Ron, or any comments to make? I'll give you a minute to gather your thoughts. Oh, David Crow would like to know, he said, am I hearing meteoric?
Yes, that's what I talked about. Yes.
Yeah.
Meteoritics. Because now, of course, that meteorites are accepted as being real. People collect them. Museums have big collections of these things. In the past, by the way, some museums threw out their meteorites because it was labeled stones from the moon. So they took the whole collection and threw it out. Some people wonder if we're throwing out a lot of the same kinds of things today.
Yeah, I'm very interested in, and this might be a comment, and I'll throw it over to Mercedes, is the applicability of some of this stuff in multiple different contexts, just the general idea of hidden events, say in organizations or in certain different societies that we may not be thinking of, because so far we're sort of narrowed down into this smaller scope, but the general idea of why things are hidden or how they're hidden, to me, is a very interesting question across the board. Any thoughts on that from the group or from Ron on that kind of thing?
Well, let me continue on for a moment unless somebody has a pressing question. And so,
We have, okay, we have two questions.
oh, good.
So let's start with Mercedes and then Jabe, and then we'll circle back to Jocko's comment.
Cool.
Mercedes, go.
Hi, I have a question. In order to discern, when do we draw the line between information that is hidden for something bigger or information that is hidden for, that's something that will go against us? Like, for example, in families, we have information that we say to everybody, and then there's some information that we don't say it because for our own benefits. So as a government, how do we discern when that information is rightly hidden and when that information is really not something that is good to hide it?
Very good. All right. So the thing is, in looking at hidden events, there are basically three stages in which hidden events find themselves. The first one is unconnected accounts, where you've got a series of random things that don't seem to make any relationship to each other. And in that state, basically, most of the time stuff gets lost because it doesn't, most people don't know that it's just general classification that this might fall into. The second stage is controversy. When people say, well, you're reporting stuff like this and so forth, but it's impossible, or it's just not happening. And this happened with the battered child syndrome. And people said, well, probably this is some sort of deficiency in the body. So these children are having broken bones because they have some kind of, a basic weakness that's causing these bones to break. The third stage is acceptance or final rejection. So the question is, what stage is this particular set of events in? And some people, for instance, I had an older gentleman come to me and he said, well, I saw this thing years ago when I saw this little ball of light, come to my cabin door when I was, in a country home and so forth. And then it came right through the screen and so forth. And he didn't know about ball lightning. So he hadn't told anybody else. And it wasn't until I gave a lecture on UFOs, he said, yeah, this is like what happened to me. He said, there's lots of stuff like this. Is that a reasonable response, Mercedes?
Yes. So what I'm thinking is there is no reason to hide. Is that okay? Thank you very much.
But nobody likes to look stupid.
Yeah.
That's a very, very important motivation. Barbara?
Well, oh, you mean okay. Jabe.
Hi, Dr. Westrum. I was wondering if you had ever looked at Bricker's work on epistemic justice. In particular, the description you had of people seeing small kangaroos, wallabies, and feeling uncomfortable speaking about it, reminds me a lot of one of her concepts called epistemic injustice, and in particular something called testimonial injustice, where people's accounts are discounted because of what they're able to know and or their race or sex or things like this. But in particular, she has a description of the way in which the idea of sexual harassment began, and she describes this one woman who had this experience, and then she went to a bunch of lawyers, and they were all a bunch of female lawyers, and they were all like, yeah, we've had that experience too, but we've never been able to talk about it because we don't have a word for what that is. So again, it's in the way that you're describing hidden events. There's many, many, many hidden events, but because there's a lack of this, like, I guess, like a social epistemology involved, an ability for the social group to discuss it, it remains hidden because there's no way to transmit the occurrence of the event. And that is a form that she describes as being testimonial injustice.
No, that's a very good phrase, because of course in the meteorite controversy, this came up again and again. It's sort of like, who are the people who are reporting this? They're peasants, you know, they don't know anything. And in one case, there's literally a meteorite shower, which was involved, you know, maybe like 1,000 meteorites falling in this one particular place. And so one of these scientists, who was very, very arrogant, wrote a letter to the journal, and he said, well, he said, it's bad enough to have one person reporting something like this, but to have a whole community, you know, making this error about this thing, which is physically impossible. He underlined physically impossible. He said, that's a real disgrace.
Yeah,
So
it seems
yes.
to me- yeah, it seems to me like it could be related to like what we call like post-normal science now, and citizen science also seems to be related to some of the ideas that you're pointing at. Anyway, I won't talk anymore, but thanks for the insights.
Yeah, no, I think that's, you know, that's, and the other stuff too. What with the sea serpents, basically the people who reported them were typically officers on the ships. And the reason's very simple. You know, they had access to the communication systems. People would believe them. You know, whereas if a mate or something like that saw it, you know, it's like, who's he? You know, you know, we all know that sailors are basically nuts.
Cool. Thank you.
So shall we continue, Barbara?
Yeah, but just to, Dave has his hand raised, but also just to sort of expand on Dave's point, you know, the child abuse and the battered child thing is really interesting, right? Because the people who were most likely, you know, in the social circle to know about what was happening to other children were other children, right?
Yes.
You knew someone this was happening to, but you were a child yourself, and it was like, well, so my adults don't do that, but maybe other adults do. And, you know, you didn't know whether this was something out of the norm or whether, and you didn't have the language to express it, to Jabe's point, but also it was just something that happened in your experience and you didn't know it was reportable. In other words, it would never have occurred to me in some cases to go to my parents and say, hey, this is happening to this kid, because I thought that was just what happened to some other kids.
Yeah.
I didn't have a context in which I could like sort of, you know, make a decision about discussion.
And so many of us faced with an event which seems counterintuitive or weird and so forth, try to keep it to ourselves because we don't want other people to reflect on, you know, that we were stupid enough to believe that it could happen and so forth. And often when children go to adults and they say, hey, there's something going on like this, the response is often, and we think about Freud and the numerous cases of what were probably child sexual abuse that Freud decided to call children's imagination. So here's a great psychologist, no doubt about that, but he's obviously discounting the fact that some of these things are reported by children.
Okay, Dave has a question and then we'll move on. So Dave.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So what's kind of the difference though, especially in the age of conspiracy theories, between hidden events and collective delusions? You know, in organizations, we're really good at hearing something and then making up a story that people believe about what's really happening that's not true.
Yes.
So, you know, what's the difference? How can you tell? What do you look for?
That's a really good question. I mean, I remember reading a book by Pierre Van Passan, who was a journalist in the early 20th century, and he was writing stories about the Apaches, from whence we got the phrase Apache dance in Paris. Okay, and these were very popular stories. He made them all up. He kept making them up because people wanted to hear about the Apaches. They didn't know that basically the French Secret Service had wiped out most of the Apaches. So, and there's always this issue, you know, have people made this stuff up? And so, you know, we have a whole vocabulary basically of how to explain what other people have, you know, spuriously reported. It's probably just their imagination, or they're just kids,
Yeah.
or, you know, this is all coming from, you know, some group that we don't think much of. So, you know, we don't need to take it seriously. So discounting is a very common thing. So the question you asked is a tough one, though. how do we know that there's something real about it? Well, one of the ways that we know that something is real is that we look for another case somewhere else. Okay, so like this case in um, Zimbabwe, where basically this school full of children had what we would definitely call UFO sighting with occupants. Okay, so obviously many of us are willing to discount, that these kids could have seen this. Maybe it was something else, maybe it was some sort of animal or something, and they just didn't get it right. But if you look at their other cases that are just like that in other countries at different times and so forth, this becomes a lot more convincing. So that's one of the reality tests that we need to do. If this is real, it's probably not unique. Fair enough, Dave?
Yeah, and I wasn't necessarily addressing the UFO issue, but
Right.
in organizations that happens all the time. There's stories and counter stories, consistent with, like Dave Snowden called them, assemblage. A group of people who have a collective story, that mythology that they hold, that may or may not be true, but it's strongly held.
Yes. Yes. And in fact, in many cases, it is this accusation that this is a mythology that prevents a variety of things like, the Me Too cases from surfacing, because somebody say, well, who's going to believe me?
Yeah.
It's his opinion versus mine, but in reality, in many cases, this stuff goes on. So let me switch to another case, which I found very interesting, and I worked on this for a long time, and I hate to admit how long I worked on it to try to explain this. So one of the things that I looked at when I got involved with the UFO business was abductions. Okay, and I wasn't interested in this originally. I was interested in the stuff that goes through the air and, makes noise or shoots rays or whatever. So the thing about the abduction case stuff is that if something like this was going on, if there was some sort of abductions happening and so forth, they'd be all over the place. Well, in the United States, we have lots of reports. I mean, we're talking about thousands of reports of people who have been investigated and so forth, and apparently, have had some sort of experience. Well, so the French, my friends, the French, they don't have, they say, abduction cases. Well, they have a few. They got 5 or 10 maybe. Well, it's just not possible. It's not possible if this is something that's happening, in my sense, and then that France would be spared these kinds of events. So I thought about this for quite a while, and I really couldn't come up with an explanation. And then one day I was doing a timeline for Bud Hopkins, who was a UFO investigator, very brilliant, absolutely brilliant investigator. So Hopkins had this case, and this is what got him into the whole subject of abductions. He had this case where basically his wine dealer, who didn't drink, by the way, was driving along through New Jersey, and here was this UFO that came down and apparently disgorged a bunch of little guys who went and started digging up the park where this thing had landed. And so, this guy goes home and he's terrified. He puts his head under the pillow and so on, and says, my God, what was this? So then one day, basically, he says something to Hopkins about it. So Hopkins decides to go home and get a tape recorder and comes back and records the testimony from the liquor dealer. And then he writes it all up and he puts it in an article in the Village Voice. So those of you who are New Yorkers are familiar with the Village Voice. And so Hopkins begins to get a bunch of mail from other people about not that event, but other events that were like it. Then Cosmopolitan, circulation roughly 2 million. This was 1971 or maybe. And so Cosmopolitan writes up this story and publishes it. And then Hopkins starts getting deluged by mail. In fact, I have in my office about 1 year's worth of letters from Bud Hopkins, about 400 letters he got, a lot of them reporting abduction-like experiences. And then I realized that's what's wrong with the French. First of all, when they deal with an abduction case, they treat it like some sort of folklore or a myth or a hallucination. The second thing is they don't do hypnosis. And the third thing is that there's no channel for them to report. In Bud Hopkins' books, there is a little, and he wrote a book, several books eventually. There's a little box that says, if you had an event like this, please report it to the following address. Well, that's where a lot of these letters that I have in my office came from. They, from people writing him because he had essentially created a channel to report this stuff. So I said, that's the explanation for the French. First of all, they don't believe the stories that people tell them. Second of all, they don't hypnotize people. And third of all, they don't have any special channels. So here's a basic aperçu about hidden events. If you create a channel that people can use to report, you're going to get more reports. Now, of course, I got a chance to present this to the French. And it was interesting because there was a meeting at the National Space Center in France, which is part of their NASA. And so I said, I'd like to give a talk on abductions. And they said, well, we really don't take abductions very seriously here, but you can give a poster if you want to. So that's what I did. I did a poster. And in the poster, I described, the stuff with Hopkins and so forth. And I said, well, maybe the French are having these events, but they're not talking about them. There's no reporting channels. And I believe this is probably true. Anyway, the French were very nice to me. They sort of patted me on the head and they said, oh, it's you Americans are just kind of crazy, So in many cases, even when you come up with a plausible explanation, it's not going to be accepted. And so do the French have abductions? I think they do. But, they're not going to get reported. Why should they be? Who's going to receive these reports? So here's an interesting example of this issue of how do you deal with hidden events. If you provide a channel, people will use that channel to report. Now, why is this important to us? Why does it matter? Are abductions really happening? Well, many of us probably feel, well, of course not. Why would they? These are people's imagination. It's some sort of popular culture thing. Well, the truth is that people like Bud Hopkins and Dave Jacobs essentially have literally hundreds of cases that they have investigated, mostly using hypnosis, but not invariably, of these kinds of things. So is the government going to talk about this? Does the government know about things like this? Well, my guess is yes, they do. And the reason is because I know of people who locally are actually looking into cases like this for the government. And so there's something going on. However, this is obviously going to be one of the last things the government wants to talk about. And it's one thing to say, well, hey, there's things buzzing overhead that could be alien spacecraft. It's a totally different matter to say, hey, aliens are coming down and they're kidnapping people and messing around with them. So here's a wonderful example of a hidden event, which is, if it's true, momentous for us, but it's something that is likely to be hidden. And for what reasons? National security, keeping the panic from publishing, keeping the public from panicking. Sorry about that. And so, so here's another example of a hidden event. So what do we get from all this? Why do we investigate hidden events? We investigate hidden events because it tells us something about the information system that we have. It's interesting to think that there's a department of sociology called Sociology of Knowledge, which tells us how we learn about the world around us, what sort of things we're likely to miss, what sort of things we are likely to notice, how we deal with stuff that happens that we don't necessarily agree with or want to find out about. And I think, as Dave said, basically, there's lots of organizations that have events that they don't want to talk about, and they're hoping other people won't notice. Having spent a lot of time looking at child abuse, there are obviously people who do not want these things to get out. I have a drawer in my office which is filled with reports of child abuse by priests. It's basically arranged by states and cities and so forth. And eventually I'm going to analyze the data and see what I can glean from it. But the most interesting thing to me is that there are systematic ways that systems choose to deal with particular kinds of events. And one of those ways essentially is to make sure that you cover up the individual event. So the event that is of interest, rather than being shared, is taken care of locally. And this is so much a pattern with the Catholic Church that there's almost no case where a priest has been accused of this stuff, where essentially that led to inquiries into other priests on whether they might be doing the same kind of thing or not. So, hidden events. I've been looking at the sort of dynamics of the, priestly scandal and so forth. And those of you who've seen the movie Spotlight are familiar with, how this happens on a local basis, but it's really a national kind of a matter. But the most interesting thing to me, by the way, as a sociologist, is that the church has always chosen to handle it by paying off the people who were abused, rather than using this as an opportunity to learn and to basically educate the priesthood about child abuse. So here's an example of then the way organizations deal with events that are anomalous. The worst example is basically that they take it out on the accusers, that they shoot the messengers. The second way basically is what the church has chosen, which is you isolate the events. You make each one of them seem unique in itself. The third thing, if some of this gets out anyway, is you engage in public relations. And you say, well, okay, this has been reported, but there's other explanations. So the fourth thing is better, but it's still insufficient, which is you respond to the individual event and you say, well, this is a unique thing. It's not very common, but here we have a case where something has obviously gone wrong. Better organizations will take a moment to do a learning experience with events by looking for more examples of the same event. And this, by the way, is typically the way the aviation industry, which I used to do work with, responds to problems with engines and things like that. They will then look, if there's a problem with one airplane, they'll look to see if other airplanes are having these same kinds of problems. A very important thing. And the third thing is that, the sixth thing is that essentially they will then try to do some sort of analysis of what is the genesis of this particular kind of event. So the way that organizations respond to anomaly then is systematically different, and it's different from one kind of information culture to another. If you have a generative information culture, people will share these events. If you have a pathological culture, they'll button up the people who are raising the notice, or they'll isolate the events. So here is a relationship between organizational culture and the way that hidden events are dealt with. So the thing is, hidden events then are potentially the precursors of things that we need to pay attention to, especially in an era where we have rapid climate changes. Things that are unusual need to be reported. They need to be investigated. I think that probably the most significant example of this that I've come across so far is the discovery of the ozone hole. I don't know how many of you know this story, but the ozone hole originally was spotted essentially by scientists down at the South Pole. Some British citizens who were using a total ozone meter and so forth. And they said, you know, we've got these patches, which basically ozone disappears in regularly. But they sat on the data. And why did they sit on the data? Because the United States had an ozone satellite that was supposed to tell them where the ozone was. And the satellite had said nothing. The British said, we don't want to look stupid by reporting something which the American satellite should be recording. So they sat on it for 2 or 3 years, and they finally said, okay, it's time to publish this. Never mind about what the Americans are doing. So as soon as they published it, the Americans thought, well, is there any way that our satellite could be missing this stuff? And guess what? The satellite had been programmed to ignore particularly high danger situations where there was apparently no ozone layer. Once they reprogrammed the computer that was interpreting the satellite data, ozone hole stood out like a big sore thumb. So it's possible that we'll even take the machines that we have and program them to ignore certain things which we don't think are likely. Barbara, I'd like to conclude on that note and ask if there are any questions.
Okay, let's open the floor. Greg has his hand up. Go for it.
Surprised I got there so quickly. Ron, it's sort of coming back to the point I mentioned earlier was around the group thing, because Dave Snowden talks about the radiology example, where you put the gorilla image on the radio slides. 17% will see it, the majority don't. But if the 17% talk to the majority will convince them that it doesn't actually exist.
Yes.
And I see that, is that sort of analogous to your stage too, where basically it's not believed at that stage, you know?
Yes. And it's interesting to see, you know, if you take anomalies, you can put them in one stage or the other and say, okay, we're at the point of, you know, sort of random reports and so forth, or we're at the controversy stage. But the interesting thing is that during the controversy stage, people will say things which are demonstrably untrue,
Yes.
because it is an easy way of getting rid of whatever it is.
Yes. And of course, the classic would be the X-Files, the series. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which went on for a long time and never actually provided any evidence.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Ron, when you talk about these things, because of course, the systems in which all of these things are happening are also really important, right? So for example, the meteors story. Well, not only, you know, may you doubt whether or not these rocks are falling from the sky, but if you report it, based on the period of time that you're in, you could end up being shunned by your community, because this could mean that, you know, this was a sign from God that you were being, you know, that you were a bad person or something, you know, there's all sorts of, or yeah, burn the witch, you know, but it is, you know, it's the, you know, the overall system that determines truth is often what Mel Conway calls ambient. You know, you're not even aware of it, but it inhibits your ability to report certain things as well.
Yeah. So there is also the issue associated with this, which actually came up at the Meteoritical Society, of meteor noise. Okay. And this noise is very interesting. This is not what you see when the bolide comes crashing down and blows up and so forth. This is seeing a grazing meteor 20 miles up. You can't possibly hear the sound from it. And people do hear sounds from grazing meteors. Okay. So maybe the person is just hallucinating. So I talked to Harvey Nininger, who's particularly interested in this subject, when I was at the Meteoritical Society. And Nininger said there was a case basically where somebody heard something and they went outside to see what it was. And here was this grazing meteor. And he said, but we really can't talk about that because, you know, it's just, and people thought Nininger was, you know, intelligent but crazy, you know, that he really believed in this stuff. So it doesn't go away. There's always something which doesn't fit into the schema that we've got. And there are people who, in spite of how scientific we are, still continue to report things which we know are impossible. It couldn't possibly happen. I remember one evening I was sitting with a couple of friends of mine drinking wine. And the husband and I were both UFO chasers. We both investigated UFO sightings. So while we're drinking wine, the wife says to me, she said, I'm one of those people you're always talking about. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I'm one of those people who had, you know, these kinds of abduction experiences. And I just about fell off my chair. And I said, why is it you never told me this? And she said, well, I didn't want to become a, you know, one of your subjects for study. So even your buddies don't necessarily tell you about this stuff.
Yeah. Yulia has her hand up. Yulia.
I also want to ask, it's a very interesting question that you raised about hearing the meteor and so on, but we also have very different ways of communicating with the outer world. So for example, there are some hypersensitive or hyper empathetic people who may hear the sound of the plants and when they are not having enough hydration. So for example, when I come back from any vacation, I literally hear the plants screaming at me and taking my attention. So the first thing I do, I go and try to water them and take all the yellow leaves out. And for example, if I see a yellow leaf during the breakfast, I stop the breakfast, take the leaf out and continue that. And it's only this year that the study came out saying that the plants actually give the extra frequency that normal average people would not hear. So my question is, to what extent can we say that these hidden events are requiring some kind of sensitivity or some kind of having the antennas focused on this specific kind of vision or hearing or feeling or sensing or whichever senses we're having. And for this reason as well, we're having the sensing the system as one of the basic ways to deal with complex questions. So how can we then think, who shall we put on this kind of watching towers as instruments, mechanism, people with specific feelings? So is this having any kind of logical background or, yeah, so tell me what you think about it. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Well, so the thing about it is you need to recognize that most human abilities have a normal curve or something like that. So you have people on each end. And so there are often people who have this special ability to hear. Sometimes it's electrical things. People walk into a store and they can hear the electrical, you know, the whatever the meter is that nobody else can hear. And so you have to recognize, and this is a very interesting thing, is that some people have extraordinary abilities. There was a guy in Britain, for instance, who was a terrific cop because he could recognize people from a very fragmentary photograph, which other people couldn't. So he'd look at somebody and say, this is such and such a person. And how he was able to do that, you know, we have no idea, but there's often a huge distribution of talents. So other people may be sensitive to things that we are not.
And the second part of the question, can we spotlight them and see where we can use them for some specific complex systems?
Absolutely. So just as there are people who have these abilities, first of all, do we ever test for these abilities to see if they, you know, that they're actually hearing or seeing something that other people can't see? We tend to think that if they see them and other people aren't seeing them, it's probably a hallucination. But we don't take account of the fact that people may have abilities that we don't. Now, this may also be true of non-human entities like ghosts or something like that, that only some people can see. Because only these people have the gift, whatever it is, of being able to see these things that are there, or to hear voices. We assume the voices they're hearing are due to some sort of internal problem, but it may be some sort of internal ability that they have to hide. So that's a thought, you know, asking people, do you have some ability that other people around you don't have? Because some of those people may be the early warning systems that we need to pay attention to. Is that a reasonable response to your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Because this is also the hidden talent, and untapping the hidden talent and specifically trying to bring this diversity or minority within specific sensing to the core of trying to understand how can we best make, you know, the palpable value of it out of it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your answer.
It may be true about smell too, is that some people can smell things on other people, you know, that they that is symptomatic of disease or a problem or something like that. And I don't, you know, in America, it's taboo to talk about smell. You know, you can't talk about how other people smell. In Arab countries, by contrast, people will often talk about, oh, I can tell your gut is feeling bad today and so forth. Edward Hall, the famous anthropologist, talked about basically dealing with the Arab populations, that many of them basically felt quite, you know, free to talk about how other people smelled. If you say that in the United States, people look at you like you're crazy. But we all smell different. And some people are particularly sensitive to how other people smell.
Okay, David has his hand up, so thank you, Yulia. Thanks.
Means I have to find the mute button and turn it off.
Right.
So that was really interesting, because talking about plants, I put the word screaming in inverted commas, certainly emitting sound would, you know, is interesting. So in autism, some autistic people have got a condition called hyperacusis. I say condition, I don't, you know, it's just something that these people have, right? And hyperacusis is where you can hear the electricity in the walls, which I think you just hinted at. And there are other sounds which really impinge on everyday life and can make it very difficult. There's also things like hyperolfaction, ultra, I can't remember what it's called, it's hypergustatory sensing, but hypersensory responses are believed, at least in autism, to be as a result of different wiring of the brain effectively. So whereas an allistic person's brain would prune a lot of the connections in the brain, an autistic person's brain doesn't prune those connections. So they make connections much more rapidly, but they make connections far exceeding the volumes that allistic people would, which is why that can become quite overloading. So that's kind of really interesting. I think there's a whole thing here about hidden events is really interesting, because obviously until a thing is proven to be a hidden event, it might not actually be a hidden event, and it might be something else. There might be an alternative explanation for it, or it might just be something that people are imagining. And I think it's a really interesting overlap between sort of that really quite out there X-Files type stuff. And in fairness, X-Files never tried to explain anything. Their aim was to keep you interested so you tuned in next week, right? That was their main goal. So you've got at one end, you've got the sort of extreme out there stuff. You've got the people who are going in and doing like ghost investigations and that sort of thing. At the other end, you've got autistic people whose hypersensitivities are well documented and they're better understood now than they used to be. There's also hyper empathy, which happens particularly in people who experience childhood abuse and childhood trauma, which is where they have become tuned into things that are likely to indicate a person is narcissistic or going to change their behavior at some point in the future, and they try to avoid that. And so, you know, when somebody says, oh, I'm empathetic, my immediate assumption is actually they're a survivor of trauma. But I don't want to be the person to rain on their parade. I also don't necessarily want to contribute to that if that feels like it's becoming a delusion. So there is, for me, hidden events is really interesting because clearly these things exist, and I work in organizations as well and I see them all the time. But actually, there is the possibility of not being able to distinguish it from conspiracy and mythos. And I like the 3 or the 4 phases of distinguishing, but I'm sort of a bit confused about what techniques could we use in an organization to start thinking about how, when things are real, when they're actually material, and when they are not. Do you see? I don't even necessarily have the language to distinguish between the two things, because I don't want to dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, you're just making it up. I also don't want to say, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. But there are also times when it is not worth spending time to investigate it further, right?
Yes, it's hard to know. It's hard to know when to dismiss something or to actually think about, well, hey, here's a message. Okay.
Yeah.
The signal noise issue. I've had cases before where basically somebody would say about such a student, such and such a student, well, this person is going to be it's going to cheat on the exam. And I thought, well, that's really prejudicial, you know. And then that person did cheat on the exam, but I dismissed it. And so a lot of times we find ourselves in the position of dismissing other people's feelings or thoughts or perceptions inappropriately. And this is particularly true if we're busy or if we don't think the other person is the kind of person we like, and therefore we're not empathic to them. Children are often tremendous censors of what's going on with other people, but we tend to dismiss what children say because they're only kids. Well, hey, those kids are tuning forks in a lot of ways. They can pick up stuff we can't.
Yeah.
Rebecca has her hand up.
Yeah, I was going to
Rebecca.
ask. Oh,
real
yeah, I
hand.
was going to. Yeah, I can't find the hand button on my thing, so I thought I would do a real hand, not a virtual hand. Anyway, Ron, you got me thinking about a lot of things, but one question I have for you is that in order to be a researcher in hidden events, you have to have let go of certainty of knowing that things just can't be the way they are. And I'm thinking about our Umwelt, which is our actions and our perceptions, is something that is evolving and changing over time. We become more perceptive in an environment. So how did you really come to accept uncertainty in order to understand this and do your research? I mean, I'm curious about you.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it was the struggle about UFOs back in the 60s, okay? I
Okay.
had a professor who told me, he said, the only reason we'd be interested in UFOs is if there are little green men in them. And he said, but if there are little green men in them, that's crazy, So it was a self-sealing, prophecy, if you will. It's like, okay, so we can't be interested in this because if it's interesting, we're not going to pay attention to it. It's really crazy. So having fought those battles with that kind of stuff, I began to look for hidden events. And so when I was sitting in this forensic medicine class, which was absolutely fascinating, this is great stuff. And I heard the stuff about the battered child syndrome. I thought, here's another one of my hidden events. Or actually, I don't remember I had the phrase hidden event at the time, but this is another one of those things that I'm interested in. Okay, so let's go check this out. And I was absolutely thrilled to talk to some of the pioneers, and having had the idea to do it before they died, because I literally talked to Henry Kemp the same year that he passed away. And to have that testimony from him about how he had managed to, see how to deal with this battered child thing. And the thing is, he had a background in public health. He had actually helped to, eradicate smallpox. So he understood the value of publicity for things like this. And so what happened is basically I got educated by the people who had these events. And especially with the abduction stuff, I think I talked to something like 30 or 40 abductees. I don't use hypnosis at all because this is beyond my skill level. But after a while, you begin to think, okay, so what about this? Who's going to look at this and stuff like this? So the other thing is, I suppose that, people like me tend to be somewhat defensive or, willing to take on authority because I had a father who literally knew everything. He was one of these disgusting people who was A+ Boy Scout, and he had never had a paper refused by a scientific journal. It was impossible not to take exception with the overwhelming.
I can relate to that. That's actually interesting because my father was a school principal. Was my principal at many, we moved around a lot, and he was my principal, which is great for being an outsider with all the other kids. And so feeling like that the boundaries are things that you can conform to, but you're really curious about all the interstitial areas, I think is kind of a way of framing that. Questioning authority, it doesn't mean that you don't follow authority at times, but it's like, okay, why are things hidden? I think that's kind of what makes you tick. Yeah.
I think
So I have just one more question, and then I'll let other people talk. It was delightful. You talk about these stages of things finally getting accepted if they hit that curve. Is it possible that there are things that are accepted and then they become hidden again?
Absolutely. And I think there's some ways in which the sea serpent is part of that. At one time, a lot of people were sort of open-minded about it, and then, it went back the other way. Moving continents, okay? The idea that the continents might move was basically dismissed at an earlier point in the 20th century. And then it was brought back again, okay? So, the interesting thing is to see how it becomes impossible in the first place, and then it becomes later on, this is the explanation. Although the underlying facts of it changed in the process of all of this. But it's more important to realize that scientists, like other people, can make mistakes. And as I was telling Jocko, when I was doing a little survey at Purdue, I got one of the guys to say something to me that was really just fascinating in itself. And he said, well, he said, it's true that there are probably sea creatures that we don't understand. He said, but it's almost certainly not what people have reported. Okay. Now think about the logic of that. Au contraire, it is almost certainly most likely to be what the people have actually seen. But
Right.
there's this attitude that, you know, the ordinary Joe or Jill can't be right. And so they have to be suppressed.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It reminds me of the book The Mismeasure of Man, you know, which is a great book about how, you know, oh, we did it such in a scientific measurement way, but then you go back and do the measurements and they're very different.
Well, there's a wonderful article called "Should the History of Science Be Rated X?" And because so many of the great scientists have fudged data,
Mm,
and so in principle, you're not supposed to fudge data, but actually, you know, this is by Stephen Brush. He's a brilliant historian of science. He's a planetary astronomer, and so the truth is that science is way more complicated than people make it out to be. When somebody says a scientific method, I just bristle because there isn't a scientific method. There's not one method. Scientists do all kinds of stuff to find things out. Like Chladni going to the library, you know, looking for anecdotal evidence about meteorites. And he found it. And he basically created this category then that people could add to and so on and so forth. So the thing about scientists is they do whatever they feel like. You know, some of them study tree rings, some of them look at meteorites, some of them look through microscopes. There's a variety of methods that lead us to science. And theorists, by the way, are different than empiricists. The kinds of things that convince them. You know, I'm a theorist. This is just my basic chemistry. And so things are convincing to me that wouldn't be convincing to other people because, you know, they want to see, you know, all this in black and white and they want to see the numbers and so forth. And theorists are just different. I mean, we're really annoying because we have these opinions and they're not always right, but we can see because of our theory that this is probably the case. So we speak authoritatively from what? Not the data, but, you know, from the little part of the data that we've seen. And this was a big problem with Freud because Freud would have one case and then he would generalize from that one case, other cases. His exploration of paranoia, for instance, had to do with the person who was homosexual. So he thought all paranoids are homosexual. Listen, nuts. You know, it's just, you have to understand that scientists have a psychology too.
Well, and that for me brings up an interesting point, and I'm going to try to pull together a couple of sort of fascinating threads that came up in the chat into one glorious ball of something. With the, you know, it's these ideas of identity and bias. You know, Jay brought up testimonial injustice and the correspondence and coherence theory of truth. David talked about identity, and one of the things that strikes me is, so for example, so I'm going to circle back to the sexual harassment idea. You know, I know you're going to all find this hard to believe, but, you know, I've lived through some of this stuff. Trust me. And so the identity question often came up in organizations when you went to report an incident or incidents. And some of the responses you got were often things like, men like us? That's other men. It's not men, you know, we're professionals. And then one memorable incident when my friend's boss said to her, have you seen his wife? She's beautiful. So the questions of like how, yes, you all shake your head now. This is, the stories are amazing, but the idea is that there's testimonial injustice, which is that we are, you know, you are not believed because of what you're saying, who you're saying it to, or who you are. And then there's also the identity and bias of the recipient of the information, right? And in some cases, some of the things you've said, Ron, you know, the identity is I'm a hyper rational person, and therefore this falls outside of what I in my rationality can bring myself to believe. And so I think that these questions of identity and language and epistemic injustice and justice loom very large in these questions of hidden events, and also how this fits into our the organizations that we're all trying to claw our way through on a daily basis.
Well, yes. If one of the things about this is there's also a sociology of hidden events that's sometimes useful. So when I was doing some research on the Yakima Indian Reservation back in 1983 on UFOs and other stuff, which I'd be happy to talk about that came up on the reservation, I discovered, well, hey, here is this Hanford nuclear area, which is right around the corner from this Indian reservation. So I wonder if they see UFOs too. So I get in my car and I motor over to Hanford, which is now the radioactive sink. And I asked to see the director of security. Well, he wasn't in, but the assistant director was there. So I sit down with him and I said, well, I'd like to talk to you about UFOs that your people see, because you've got an Indian reservation where they're seeing stuff all the time. And I figured, you know, if it's a physical thing, it must be over here too. And he said, well, you know, there really haven't been any sightings, which by the way was untrue. He said, and I said to him, well, you know, sometimes the stuff doesn't bubble up to the top, you know. And he said, well, let's check that out. So he calls up the head of patrol and he says to the head of patrol, he said, do you know about any UFO sightings? And head of patrol says, well, no, I don't. He said, but wait a minute, there's a 40-year veteran here, you know, who's sitting in the office. Let's ask him. Oh, when was that? Oh, and he hangs up the phone. So the thing is that I knew perfectly well that with that kind of attitude, you know, there wasn't going to be a lot of reporting. So I said, you know, if you you ought to do a little survey to find out how many of your people are seeing this stuff, because this is a, you know, national security area, that armed guards, helicopters, the whole works. And if people are not reporting stuff that they see moving through the air, that's a problem. Okay.
Yeah, any sentence that begins with, well, there haven't really been, in terms of testimony, there haven't really been, sort of indicates that something's happened, but they don't want to talk about it.
Right. The fix is on.
Yeah, I mean, well, or even just it's beyond the scope of what we understand, and therefore it has to be dismissed. And I think it's really interesting because I know there might still be a couple of people on here who work in incidents and safety. And you see these kinds of patterns all the time, right? That an incident can be dismissed until it becomes a pattern. But the collection of enough data to the way data is often collected is so dispersed that you cannot see the pattern. You know, this happens all the time in things like sexual assault reporting and things like that. You can't see a pattern because the way the data is collected, the way the reporting is recorded is so distributed and behind certain, you know, informational walls that you cannot observe the pattern.
Yes, well, this is a big issue with serial killers. You know, what constitutes another case of, you know, a series of these crimes? It's especially true of the doctor-nurse killers, who are people who, you know, are regularly in a position to do other people grave harm and have that harm hidden. And the bias is always that the nurse or the doctor has done the best they can. So I forget, I think it was Shipton was the name of the British doctor who'd killed like 300 older people. Okay.
But yeah, Harold Shipman.
Shipman, okay.
Him earlier, oddly enough.
Thank you. So this is a real, and of course with priests, it's obviously the same kind of thing. It's that usually there have been earlier reports and people sort of dismiss the earlier reports. So the problem is if you don't collect the data, you don't get enough people to have what they call neural systems, a summation effect, where the data sort of comes together. And this is particularly important when you're dealing with people who are serial whatevers. And unfortunately, in organizations, if the culture is bad, if it's pathological, where people are afraid to speak up, these effects of silence and so on will be exaggerated. And the other interesting part of this, of course, is that often the supervisors of these organizations don't believe their people have seen anything, but they haven't ever asked them, have you seen anything? There was a famous case where some UFO investigator went to a big national laboratory, and he talks to the director and said, oh, he said, my people don't see these sort of things. But the investigator knew perfectly well that several of them had seen this stuff. And it's sort of like Galileo saying, well, but yet it does move,
But it's also how you frame the question, right?
It is.
Because that's another, interesting aspect to all of this, is how the questions are framed in order to elicit the response. Dave has his hand up. Dave.
Yeah, and you mentioned safety, and we've done a lot of work in safety. We did a sense maker project on it. And one of the things that we discovered was a common pattern was the inability to handle or deal with ambiguous situations. And I think that kind of ties in with some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something comes up and it's just very messy and ambiguous and all that. And we just don't know what to do. And so we just defer to our common patterns.
Yeah. And I think that, unfortunately, many times when somebody turns out to be a bad person and they're doing evil things, a lot of times you have seen previously that same tendency at work, but you dismissed it because, they're a colleague, or, they wouldn't do that,
Well, in many cases, they're not bad or evil either. They're just trying to get the job done. And so, again, I think that sort of adds to the ambiguity. And I just saw Rebecca Brock's comment on quality problems at Boeing, and I'm a 37-year Boeing retiree, so.
I've been studying them for a while, so.
Yeah, if you want to contact me offline, we can have an interesting discussion. I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah, Greg Brome, it reminds me of, is it messy coherence that Dave talks about all the time?
Yeah, it mentioned in the chat.
Yeah, oh, you did. Okay, I wasn't paying attention. Oh, that wasn't good. But yeah. But yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about messy coherence, I think that's got a lot to do with what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the idea is it's not necessarily the fact that you have to have group coherence around this, but the fact that there actually is an individual can make a coherent argument. So it might be the one standing up against the many, and that the way Dave talks about it is labeled as messy coherence, because if that's articulate, so there is a rational, or appears to be a rational argument for it, maybe we should take it as face value and we should explore it. And that sort of gives you a way of then starting to look at this and turn the discussion around, because typically that person would be ostracized, from the groupthink we touched on before, but also to Ron's point was the fact that is this a unique event, and therefore we don't basically take value at all, because I liked his comment earlier was the fact that if these are real events, they won't be unique. So you've actually got to wait for multiple events to occur. How do you weight that? Can you weight it towards the one, or do you actually need the many, or do you need somewhere in between? And I think that sort of comes back to a lot of the social context as well, which you're touching on, Barbara. It's not simply as accepting messy coherence. It's also about what the wider group will actually think about. And And I was interested about Dave working for Boeing. I saw the workers accepted the pay offer today. But as you probably appreciate, it's a lot more layered discussions around this. You know, you got all the McDonnell Douglas and all the financial discussions that can come into the back of this as well.
There's a lot of history and a lot of agendas.
Yes.
Yeah. The culture of Boeing is actually tremendous interest to me, because here you had an organization that was capable of doing things like the 777 and the 747 and so on. It really required a remarkable organization, an organization that actually could turn on a dime. I'll give you some examples if you want, but it had a tremendous level of trust, and that to have that level of trust and to do anything that would interfere with that level of trust is enormously damaging to the organizational culture. And the idea of trying to recover that culture is a wonderful idea, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get that back together.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a multi-generational commitment to the organization by people who are skilled and who have tremendous amounts of tacit knowledge and so forth, and being able to capture that knowledge and bring it together to make an airplane, absolutely extraordinary thing. And it's amazing to me that nobody bothered to study how Boeing had managed to do that. And the 747 case is a really interesting one, because here was something where the company was nearly brought low simply by the cost of trying to get engines that worked for this airplane. And essentially, you know, they were able to keep doing this stuff in spite of the fact that they were losing, $1 million a day or something like that. And they had
Which
faith.
was real money back then.
Yes, absolutely. And they stuck it out. Sutter was able to get people to do this, and they really were the Incredibles, okay? And nobody said, well, hey, this is a marvelous organization. Let's take a look at it and see how we get this level of trust. They concentrated on the technology,
Yeah.
and not on the people.
So I'm speaking in February, and we'll probably cover a lot of that.
Nice plug.
Good
Thanks,
show.
Dave.
And
Yeah,
I'm
Dave-
retired, so I can, just say it.
Yeah, Dave will be our guest in February at the lounge. And I don't know what he's going to talk about.
Me
But,
neither.
But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, like the whole culture and the cultural question is really interesting, right? Because it goes back to this idea of what we're willing to accept and how coherent things have to be with the accepted worldview and what it takes to change the worldview. And now, right, some of us on this call grew up with what used to be called, trusted sources of news. I think that we can, with some degree of confidence, say those days are over. But also the narrative managers, the sources from which we get our information are more diverse. The quality of those sources can be questionable, or are just more diverse. But it's also more difficult to create a personally create a coherent narrative. You can be presented with them, but as I look at the different information that I'm fed through my various, social media feeds, news outlets, and things like that, it can be very difficult for me to create a coherent narrative about hidden events as they start to come to the fore. And that's often tied to my own personal use of language and things like that, and how the question is framed for me. And I come back to this all the time because, Ron, one of the things you were telling us before was about the, and I'd like you to retell that story about the, well, it wasn't green.
Ah, yes. So one of the Roswell witnesses who had actually seen the creatures, not just the craft, but the creatures, basically, essentially publicly had said, well, yeah, that really wasn't anything there. But basically somebody said something about little green men, and he said they weren't green. He was one of the kids that basically other people have worked out had probably been in contact with the creatures. And he said they weren't green. Okay. So here's a slip of the tongue, if you will, but here is somebody saying, okay, this really did happen after all. After all this Air Force stuff to suppress, and they were really nasty about it. I mean, they literally send bullies to bully people to shut up and not talk about it. And one of them was so bad that his son, decades later, came and presented to one of the witnesses a bundle of flowers, and he said, "This is what my father wanted me to give to you, because he was so hard on you back in 47."
But a lot of it is about like what it is you're being asked, and what it is you like. If they ask you, did you see any little green men? Your answer is no. It wouldn't be till later that you would say, well, they weren't green. And so I keep coming back to this idea of, bias, because a lot of the work we do in this meetup and in other discussions about complexity is overcoming our own inherent bias, or at least examining it in terms of the information that we're being given and the situation that we're in. And so I think that for me, the sort of overarching thing here is that it's easy to dismiss these things, right? And we often do it. It's like, nope, conspiracy theory, this, that, the other thing. And then it's not till years later that the information surfaces or the pattern surfaces that says, oh, yes, that's true.
I think what I'd mention here would be Andy Clark's work on the brain.
Yeah.
And this touches on what Dave was touching about, the difference between autism, neurodiverse people, and neurotypical. And Andy's current thinking is really the fact that what actually happens with autistic people is the information, the senses override the models. Neurotypical people, basically the model overrides the sensing and dictates their behavior. So this is why you see in extreme autistic people basically very wild behavior and very very untypical behavior. If they get upset at something, they'll just go off in a rant, because they're reacting to the environment and not being moderated by a internal model. So I think a lot of, when you start talking about biases, you can't really start talking about biases without starting to think about the neurotypical neurodiversity discussion.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a very important component of all of this, and it's another reason why I think that so many of the hidden events that Ron was talking about were easily dismissed.
Yes. Yeah. But I'd be very interested if someone did a longitudinal study of this, how many of the people who saw things were actually deemed to be neurotypical versus neurodiverse.
Interesting. Yes. Well, especially when you're dealing with things like ghosts.
Yes.
And I mean, this is not something I know anything about, so I'm not going to opine on it. But here is something which, there's no question that some people see more things than other people do. And so the question is, well, why do they see it? And is they're seeing veridical, or is it something that they're just weird, so, but I think we have to maintain basically an open mind. That's it's very difficult to do, especially if you're an expert in some area. The worst are experts, because they think, oh, well, it can't be, therefore it isn't, but the problem is that a lot of times, I mean, the perfect example of this is the City Core building was basically brought into safety because some students said, well, how do we know that it's safe? So they called up, what was his name? The engineering consultant who had put a mass damper on the top of the building. So the student says, well, how do we know that it's safe? And he said, well, of course it's safe because if they did it according to the way that I laid it out, it would be safe. And then he thought, but wait a minute, how do I know that they did it according to plan? So he calls them up. He calls up the company and he said, well, did you do this according to the way I laid it down? He said, yeah, we just made a small substitution. Instead of welds, we have rivets. Okay.
Yep.
And that was the key point. At that point, he realized, hey, we haven't really done all the tests on this building and, wind studies and so forth that we need to do because they did it a different way. And it rapidly became clear that the building was basically ready to fall apart if it had a wind that they got once every 16 years on average. So literally the people were living on borrowed time. And so at the same time they were fixing it, by the way, surreptitiously, they would pull off the panels when the secretaries went home, and then they went out at the joints and welded them. They were constantly having an eye over their shoulder to see what the weather was going to do, that it wasn't going to be one of these storm conditions that would tear down the building. I mean, I wouldn't have been in their shoes for anything because, of course, if something had happened, there would be a huge disaster. Even if it happened at night, there would be a huge disaster. So
yes, you don't want to be in the building when it falls down, but knowing that, then you're open to legal jeopardy.
Words to live by, Greg. You don't want to be in the building when it falls down. I'll work on that.
Another case for work from home.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting for me in the context of complexity to listen to this conversation, because as I see the various threads, I see how they tie together, and I see the way that your work, Ron, really ties into a lot of the things we talk about. You are talking here about cases like UFOs, but these things apply across the board. We've had examples of these things happening in organizations and the changes that have been wrought over time. When I was and I'll go back to the sexual harassment thing, but when I was a young woman, those things were routinely dismissed. And now it is accepted practice that those things need to be dealt with. Hopefully.
Right. And there's rules for reporting. If you have something that's a weird case, you report it immediately. It has to go up the chain. And this is certainly the case where my university said, no, it's no longer up to the department head to decide. If he hears something that potentially falls into this, he has to report it.
Yeah, and there's I mean, and to the child abuse example, now there are reporting obligations placed on teachers and social workers and psychologists, and
they're the ones that usually report, not the doctors. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at what David is saying something interesting about his experience as a
So I used to be a safeguarding officer for an ambulance service, which obviously means you see things that actually doctors don't see because they don't go into the home. And one of the things we used to have to do is talk to the ambulance crews about why reporting these things is so important. You would actually have crews come on the training day really resenting, because we don't want to have to do this, but actually by the end of it you've got people going, actually we get now why we need to report every single star that we see so that the constellation can be drawn later, because it's not us that are going to perceive that constellation, It's the people who have got the bigger picture and can see all of the stars relating to that child or that vulnerable adult and put that together. And it's traumatic for people, but once they understand that context, it generally becomes easier for them to comply with it. They worry less about misreporting stuff because they understand that it's never one thing that triggers something, unless it's, something catastrophic, in which case it should do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of what we've been talking about. And, one of the, the corollary to your child abuse example, Ron, is that now, at least I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but in the United States, now we're having a similar set of discoveries around that kind of abuse in nursing homes.
So Henry Kemp actually knew perfectly well when he coined the term of battered child syndrome that there was sexual abuse of children. However, he felt that the spirit of the time, if he reported that right away, that it would all be dismissed as some sort of fake memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so he literally sat on the issue for 18 years until the physical abuse stuff had been accepted. And then he brought up the sexual abuse stuff. And he said, 18 years ago, I told you about child abuse. So I'm telling you there's a different kind of child abuse now. And we have lots of, we actually have tools to deal with this and so forth. But now it is time to come forward on this subject and confront this face to face. And whether his judgment was good or bad, I hesitate to say, but he did a great deal of good by bringing forward the idea of child abuse and educated people on the subject. And he was actually a brilliant pediatrician, and in a variety of other ways innovated for the patients on his ward. But the interesting thing to me is, and here's something that we're being stepped through this stuff on UFOs by the government, as I call the dance of the seven veils. And that's really what's going on. So the easier stuff is going to be brought forward first, and the hard stuff is going to be reserved for later. That's my guess. The abduction stuff is very hard stuff. Nobody really wants to deal with this, including me. But it's something it's probably going on.
We're very good at not wanting to deal with things as a species. Let's not talk about it. It'll be better. And I think it is important to point out that, and this is something that I hear a lot with these things. Well, this is a very recent issue. And of course, this has always been an issue. It's just that we've changed the frame, or David, the narrative, arc. But so many of these things were under the surface for so long, were for hidden. And I'm not talking about like for decades. I'm talking about like centuries. We're just not going to talk about that. Or it's it's just evil doesn't need to be discussed, was something you used to hear a lot. And now that things are surfacing and we're seeing these patterns and we're accepting these things, our human brain says, well, okay, we understand this, and we know what's happening. But the answer is we don't know what happened, and we don't know how long this has been a problem. And we're just beginning to understand the systemic and intergenerational nature of a lot of these problems, as opposed to an isolated event by a bad actor. Greg.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, have you seen some of the evidence that's coming out around DNA testing in the US around interfamily intercourse?
Oh. Well, on that note, Greg, I think we have to start wrapping up. I think Greg has drawn a line under things for us, Ron. No, I mean, if you have any final thoughts, I'd love to hear them. We're at the hour, so we should probably start wrapping it up.
Yeah, well, I think the main point I wanted to express to you essentially is that there is a dynamics to these things. And if you study the dynamics, then a lot of times when you're confronting a new set of events, you'll understand both the limitations of whatever you're trying to do and also be more likely to think about, hey, I wonder if this is an earlier part of the cycle and it's actually going to change. And so the thing with the abduction business is, well, it's bad enough to accept the UFO stuff, and so I'm on one hand, I'm really amazed that the French, went as far as they did. And there was a series of events. I don't know if any of you know about this in 1954, where the French literally were inundated with close encounter events. And we're very lucky that somebody actually wrote a book about all of these different events. It's a thick book, okay? But now it's out of the public realm because people simply forgotten about it. But the issue is with abductions, here's something that's different. It's definitely threatening. There's lots of alternative explanations, and I would be absolutely delighted. It's hard for you to believe this, but I would be absolutely delighted if it turned out that this was some sort of psychological quirk that we could explain away. I don't think it is. So we'll have to confront it. We don't want to do it.
Well, on that note, if no one has anything to add, I'll say, Ron, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Please come back anytime. We'd love to hear more about the hidden events. We'd love to hear about organizational typologies and the Sidewinder because, clearly some of you are really into that. And to all of you, thank you so much. Thanks for hanging in with us. The recording will be posted soon. I hope you'll all join us in December when our scheduled guest is David Snowden. So once again, thank you, Ron, and thanks to all of you, and bye. See you soon.